is Kate McNamara. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service and Department of Government. Welcome to our seminar today. Before we begin, I would just like to note that the Mortara Center acknowledges that Georgetown's success today is the product of enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people. If you'd like to learn more about Georgetown University's efforts to understand and address its role in the injustice of slavery, you can go to slavery.georgetown.edu. It's very appropriate that I begin that way because our series, GPEP-R, is a new series which focuses on the race in the field of international political economy. We've been running this series all semester. It will continue again after the new year. If you'd like to find out more about the series, please go to the Mortara website, mortara.georgetown.edu. And we also have, of course, video recordings of our different events. So we hope you would like to access those. The series is part of a broader effort that Abe Newman and I are running at Georgetown called the Global Political Economy Project. We're trying to advocate for the recasting of the study of political economy in a more global light that looks at how global markets shape people's lives and how globalization might be harnessed for the greater good. Our substantive foci that we're looking at are ecological sustainability, inequality, cultural identity, digital technologies, and power dynamics. The program is supported by the Open Society Foundation's Economic Justice Program, to whom we're very grateful. So today we are very particularly excited to have Zoltán Búzás, who is an assistant professor of politics at Drexel University, who specializes in international law and norms, race and human rights. He's really at the cutting edge of a lot of research around race in international relations. He has a forthcoming book, Evading Norms, Race and Rights in the Shadow of Legality, as well as a slew of articles in journals like International Organization and ISQ. Zoltán will present for about 20 minutes, just giving us a really brief overview of some of his research and how we might learn from it. I'm going to follow up with a few questions, and then we'll open to the audience Q&A. So please go ahead throughout Zoltán's presentation and submit questions through the Q&A function. We'd love to also have your name and affiliation as well. I'll go ahead and read those questions out and group them together, and hopefully we'll have a really interesting conversation after the speaker's presentation. So without further ado, I will turn over to Zoltán and look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you, Kate, for that nice introduction. It is really terrific to be here. And I just want to say that I'm so delighted that you put together this excellent speaker series on race and help elevate the visibility of this important topic in the discipline. When I was writing my dissertation about 10 years ago, there was very little interest in race. And so I'm so excited to see that there's more interest in it today. And I'm sure that those who have been working on this topic much longer than I have would concur. And as Kate mentioned, much of my interest focuses on international law and norms, and I'm specifically interested in the extent to which these laws and norms can advance racial equality and the limits that they have. And so today I'm planning to talk a little bit about these issues. I'm going to first set up the conversation in the context of the liberal order, and then I will discuss three insights from my research that speak to racial equality and inequality. So let me just try to share my slides with you. Let's see. All right, so hopefully you can see the first slide well. And as I said, so today's conversation will be based on racial equality and inequality in the liberal international order. And I define the liberal international order conventionally as an open and rule-based arrangement among states. And in 1945 in San Francisco, where the foundations of the liberal order were established, many of the delegates attributed the atrocities committed during the war to racist ideologies. And examples include what John Dower called the war without mercy in the Pacific, the Holocaust, and other atrocities committed by Nazi Germany and others. And so there was an effort to build the new emerging liberal order on the principles of racial equality. And they included racial equality in the UN Charter, prohibited racial discrimination, and I will say more about this later. And then in subsequent decades, racial equality has been enshrined in a number of legally binding human rights treaties. And the first one of these treaties to come into force in 1969 was actually the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So what we have today is a dense network of international egalitarian laws and institutions. And unfortunately, this de jure racial equality in the liberal order contrasts with de facto racial inequality. So we all know that there's a tremendous racial inequality in the real world, and domestically, inequality ranges from criminal justice and wealth to housing and health. And these inequalities have been further or have been reflected and magnified by the current pandemic. Internationally, we see concerns about the underrepresentation and bias in international rules and institutions. Just to mention a few examples, there are concerns about non-Western underrepresentation in key institutions such as the UN Security Council. There are concerns about biases against developing states in international rules, including trade rules, trade law, and then you may be familiar with recent discussions about the anti-African bias of the International Criminal Court, which one Gambian information minister called the International Caucasian Court. And so we see this frustration here that 75 years after San Francisco, while some racial progress may have been made, there's still so much to do. And this is captured by one sign that was held at a global protest triggered by George Floyd's killing by the Minneapolis police. And I quote the sign, "We didn't come this far to only come this far." And so a key question that I want to ask is, how do racial inequality and discrimination persist given numerous international equality laws and institutions? And of course, this is a question that many scholars of racism have struggled with, and previous speakers in the GPEP series have articulated eloquent answers to it. But my focus in the remainder of the talk is on three issues that come out of my research, and they include what I call embedded racism, and this is basically, as I will elaborate in a minute, it refers to ways in which the scope of international de jure racial equality can be narrowed in its application to various states. The second is norm evasion, which is essentially a form of loopholing. One can think of it in our context as racial discrimination that is technically legal. And finally, I want to talk a little about prejudices and their impact in upholding inequality and discrimination. So let's start with embedded racism. And this is a term that I briefly discuss in my piece, Racism and Anti-Racism in the Liberal International Order, which is forthcoming in International Organization's 75th anniversary special issue. And I'm inspired by John Ruggie's well-known embedded liberalism, which, as you may know, refers to deviation, domestic deviation that's allowed under international rules. So domestic deviation or opt-outs allowed from the international free market liberalism. And there's something similar going on in the issue area of race. So embedded racism then entails deviation from international racial equality provisions to accommodate domestic racism, to shield domestic racism from international interference. And this can be done in a variety of ways. So even though international racial equality aspires to universality, its scope is often narrowed in a number of ways. And one example is, or one way in which this is done is through the doctrine of domestic jurisdiction. And domestic jurisdiction simply refers to giving states the exclusive authority over particular issues that occur in their own territory. And one example of the doctrine of domestic jurisdiction comes from the UN Charter, Article 2.7, which I quote, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." And a few know that this doctrine or this article was codified in the UN Charter in part to protect domestic racist institutions from international interference. And so it is worth giving a bit of historical background here. So in 1945 in San Francisco, as I mentioned earlier, there was a sense that because racist atrocities have delegitimated racial inequality, a new legitimate order could not be erected on principles of racial inequality. However, delegates had disagreements over racial equality. Should it be explicitly enshrined in the UN Charter? If so, what should its scope be? And so on. So we can identify basically two coalitions at the time which struggled over these matters. What I call the transformative coalition, a transnational network of political actors which pushed for racial equality and its inclusion in the UN Charter, included delegates from South America, the Middle East, Asia, some from the West like France. Their African states were colonized at the time and so had less influence at the conference, but many Black internationalists voiced their support for racial equality and decolonization in other venues, including the Fifth Pan-African Congress organized in 1945 in Manchester, the UK. And then there were a number of non-state actors that also pushed in the same direction, including the NAACP, the National Council of Negro Women from the US, as well as the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy from Canada. On the other side, there was the traditional coalition, which resisted these efforts. It included many Western delegates, especially Anglo states and European colonial powers. And they couldn't explicitly say that we oppose racial equality at the time. So instead, they embraced domestic jurisdiction in part to hide what a British a diplomat and an acting secretary general called skeletons in their cupboard, and they wanted to shield these skeletons from international interference. So such racist skeletons include, of course, domestic racist laws and institutions. Think here of apartheid South Africa, think of white Australia, Jim Crow in the US, and so on. And then there were, of course, colonial empires to be protected as well. So as a result of struggles between these two coalitions, what we ended up with in the UN Charter is racial equality limited by what I labeled embedded racism. So racial equality and the prohibition on racial discrimination was included in the Charter thanks to transformative efforts in a variety of articles which I listed on this slide. But the scope of international racial equality was limited by embedded racism, specifically domestic jurisdiction or sovereignty, because of traditionalist resistance. And Article 2.7 in the Charter exemplifies this. Now, later, domestic jurisdiction was challenged by anti-colonial nationalists and civil rights advocates who worked hard to abolish explicitly racist domestic institutions and laws. But there are good reasons to think that embedded racism continues in in subtle ways. And so one interesting uh, kind of future research question would be, how does this happen? Whether, for example, reservations in some international treaties can have similar effects. And so this would be something to look at if you're interested in studying race in international politics. The second way in which racial inequality and discrimination continues in a liberal order characterized by de jure racial equality is through what I call norm evasion. And this is an argument that I developed comprehensively in my forthcoming book, Evading International Norms, Race and Rights in the Shadow of Legality. Essentially, one can think of norm evasion as a form of loopholing, and you could think of it as actions that are normatively inappropriate but technically legal, or another way to phrase this is actions that are awful but lawful, kind of a catchier way to look at it, or actions that are immoral but legal. And in our context, what's helpful about this concept of norm evasion is that it can capture racial discrimination that is technically legal. And this is something that I study in the context of the Roma. And you may not be familiar with the Roma, also known as Gypsies, but they are among the largest minorities in Europe, about 10 million, although the statistics are not entirely reliable. And they're among the most marginalized groups. They have suffered through slavery, the Holocaust, and today, no matter what indicator you look at, you can usually see that the Roma do worse than other racial and ethnic groups in Europe. And I want to illustrate this concept of norm evasion with a quick example, which refers to this policy of humanitarian returns. So after 2007, when Romania and Bulgaria joined the European Union, about 15 to 20,000 Roma immigrants went to France in search of a better life. And the arrival of these highly visible and generally poor immigrants elicited strong opposition, especially from most of the French public. And this public put pressure on French officials to remove these unwanted immigrants. The problem was that European Union legislation, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights, prohibit the collective expulsion of people based on race and ethnicity. And so removing the Roma, expelling them or deporting them blatantly would have violated these laws, would have invited adverse court rulings by domestic and European courts, and would have inflicted considerable legal costs on the state. To satisfy the domestic constituents without having to pay these legal costs, French officials devised a clever strategy. Under humanitarian returns, they offered Roma nominal amounts of money to leave the country. Now, these departures occurred in the shadow of deep Roma poverty and police intimidation and were widely seen as discriminatory, violating the norm of racial equality, including by over half of the French officials that I interviewed. Nonetheless, France could claim that these departures did not technically qualify as expulsions, and therefore they were technically legal. And indeed, to date, there's no domestic or European court ruling against humanitarian returns. And this is partly because these courts understand expulsions very narrowly based on a narrow meaning of compulsion. And so these subtle means of compulsion, like humanitarian returns, don't register on the legal radars of these courts. And I want to use this example to ask a broader question. How do we make sense of cases like humanitarian returns, right? Cases that hurt specific racial and ethnic groups, but are technically legal. Existing studies argue that states commit to, but do not comply with human rights and racial equality laws. So from this perspective, you can identify the problem by looking at transgressions of the law. And there's much to this argument, there's much value to it, but the problem with such studies that focus on illegality is that they miss actions that are awful but lawful, actions like humanitarian returns. And so to capture this sort of behavior, this awful but lawful behavior, which I call norm evasion, I formulate an argument based on 3 building blocks. The first one is norm law gaps. So simply here, I start from a premise of legal pluralism, and I argue that human rights generally and racial equality specifically are enshrined in a number of different rules, including laws and norms, which I understand conventionally as collective expectations of normative of appropriate behavior, and that these norms and laws, although often conflated, are not the same. They only imperfectly reflect each other. There are gaps between them, which means that legality and normative appropriateness, that is, complying with the law and following the norms, are not always the same. And there are instances in which they diverge. And think here of cases involving smoking, abortion, the use of mercenaries in international politics. So you can see cases where certain actions are normatively inappropriate, violate norms, but they're technically legal. And there are many reasons for norm evasion. So here I turn to the second point, but I focus on one kind of causal driver of it, which is colliding pressure on the state. Now, I argue when the state is under pressure on the one hand from advocates of racial equality, and on the other, their opponents, under conditions that I spell out in the book, officials find it attractive to engage in norm evasion. And again, norm evasion refers to actions that are normatively appropriate or moral, but are inappropriate, but technically legal. So these are, again, actions that are awful but lawful, and we care about them because they capture discrimination in the shadow of legality, the violation of norms of racial equality in ways that are nonetheless technically legal. I'm not going to, obviously, we don't have time to go into the case and evidence of the book, but you can see that I focus on 2 cases, France's expulsion of Roma immigrants and the Czech Republic's segregation of Roma children in special schools. These are schools for those with mild mental disabilities, and on a variety of types of evidence, or including over 160 semi-structured interviews and 370 court rulings, I show that during the period that I've studied, or much of it, France and the Czech Republic's treatment of the Roma qualifies as norm evasion. How this argument about norm evasion and wrongdoing in the shadow of legality can be generalized by other or to other issues. And so I think this is another potentially fruitful direction where those of you interested could study discrimination, cases of discrimination that may be technically legal in other areas. And very briefly, I want to touch on a third reason why discrimination persists despite racial equality laws, and that's because prejudices persist. And some of these prejudices have become more implicit as being racist has become normatively inappropriate or unacceptable, but these prejudices still persist. In my dissertation and the security studies article, I focus specifically on how prejudices shape threat perceptions. So I call this argument the color of threat. And I look at kind of this is a two-step argument. I look at first how racial prejudices can shape threat perceptions, and then how these racially tainted threat perceptions have a shape our behavior, specifically foreign policy. And to give you an example, the yellow peril is one racially inflated Western/US threat perception that we hold toward China, toward Japan. And I look at how this racially inflated threat perception can hinder cooperation in three cases. The first one is the demise of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in the 1920s. The second is when China acquired nuclear weapons in the 1960s. And then a third example is Japanese foreign direct investment in the United States in 1970s, 1980s, which was the fears of this investment were racially inflated and caused difficulties in Japanese-American relations. Now, more work is needed on to the extent to which such racial prejudices shape our perception of China and maybe distort Sino-American relations. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that the China threat or fears of China are purely a function of racial prejudices. There are very good reasons to be concerned about China, but we also want to make sure that our concerns are not racially inflated such that they would result in suboptimal foreign policy. I think that was it. Thank you for your attention, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zoltán. And I really appreciate you kind of, taking your vast amount of work and packaging it in this short, accessible kind of overview. I think it gives us all a bunch of really nice things to try to dig into. So I'm going to start off with a couple questions. We already have an interesting question in the Q&A. Other folks watching, please go ahead and put your questions down. And I'm going to start with just two questions, and I think I'm going to pick up a little bit on two of your sort of 3 points of sort of, what are the kind of reasons why we see the difference, stark difference in some cases between the de facto and the de jure racial equality. So first, you talked about embedded racism, and to me that's very much a story about sort of the domestic politics and the domestic societal interactions that kind of produce these kind of carve outs from the international systemic level agreements, right? And I want to take us right to the present moment and ask you what role you think Black Lives Matter will have on particularly the American ability to kind of shelter itself from these broader commitments, and whether we might be seeing a moment of a change from a more sort of traditional coalition around anti-racism to something that's more transformational. Do you think that the US might be on, hopefully, the verge of a more profound transformation that would change that kind of embedded racism? That's my first question.
Great question, Kate. Thank you. I confess, I like you said, there's this aspect of the embedded racism that has to do with domestic politics, and so given that my knowledge in that area is shakier, I can only speculate on these issues. But I will say here, I would recommend Keisha Blaine's recent foreign affairs piece, which also shows that the transformational coalition has this very transnational, international aspect where we cannot just think of Black Lives Matter, for example, in the US domestic context, but we need to think about their allies abroad and how that has, for example, contributed to the global wave of protests in the wake of George Floyd's killing. And so I think that um, that is encouraging as we think about the balance of power between the traditional and the transformative coalition, to see these grassroots movements and how they can organize transnationally, because we know that the traditional coalition is also very apt at organizing transnationally. And so it's heartening and encouraging to see that on the transformative side. Whether Black Lives Matter would decrease embedded racism as it applies to the US, I think it is hard to say, but certainly uh, would make it more difficult to sustain some aspects of it. So, obviously the US political context is very polarized. We still have many people who would probably support those carve-outs and those forms of embedded racism. And so it would be a struggle, but I'm encouraged by the results of the election. And because of that, I'm hoping that having an executive that is more hospitable to racial equality, even if doesn't have the program for racial equality that you might see as ideal, certainly compared with a second Trump administration, it is encouraging. So I'm hoping that political power linking up with some grassroots movement like BLM would push us in a transformational direction. At the very least, it would not result in further regress. And so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I really like your emphasis on, thinking through these sort of transnational actors and coalitions kind of duking it out, right, on these different sides. And, something Abe and I have really kind of tried to push forward in our work and with GPEP is the notion that, politics is so not national, right? That we need to kind of think outside these sort of bounded units of the state, that these issues are absolutely being contested in all kinds of different sites of political authority, and that the social conversation around that is absolutely happening in a transnational way. So I appreciate that very much. Let me move on then to my second question, which kind of I think maybe moves forward from my first, which is this question about kind of norm evasion. And I didn't know lawful but awful. I didn't know that expression, and that's actually really helpful. And presumably one of the reasons that norm evasion is successful is because there's a certain kind of hiddenness and a lack of visibility, and thus the sort of hypocrisy is able to go forward because there's a sort of plausible deniability about what's going on. And I wanted you, and this is going to be kind of a hard question, but I think we're all struggling with it, which is, when we think about this liberal international order that supposedly, was infusing global governance, infusing America's role in the world, over the past however many decades, 5 decades, and there certainly seems to be still even this kind of nostalgia for that liberal international order. And the IO special issue is interesting because in a way it's fascinating to see so many great scholars, so much great scholarship sort of all kind of around this notion of the liberal international order. But of course your piece reminds us that the liberal international order also kept invisible, right, this really important thing, which was that racism was built into it, right? That in fact, it did not adhere to kind of liberal ideals as we might understand them, right? Of the equality of all people, of the sort of, importance of sort of everyone's human potential needs to be realized, right? So how should we think, and me as a teacher of international politics, for my master's students, my PhD students, my undergrads, how should we be thinking and teaching about the liberal and international order, and sort of, do you actually, one argument would be, that it was white, that it was like deeply white and Eurocentric, and that, if we read the post-colonial literature, that immediately makes us see it in a very different light. So I was hoping, I know this isn't even really a question, but help me kind of think through, how we as IR scholars should be reevaluating the liberal international order, and what do you sort of see in terms of sort of the scholarship going forward, and how we might kind of situate that. I know it's terrible question, but
there's certainly a lot there. So I'll try to share some
just react. Yeah.
pertinent thoughts. And so I think how to think about the liberal order through a kind of a racial lens, I think is a tricky question. I think there's a tendency to either say, oh, the liberal order is colorblind, or it's all about racial equality. Look at all the wonderful international human rights treaties that we've passed that explicitly prohibit racial discrimination. And so therefore, right, we mainly or largely solve the problem of racial discrimination. And then the pushback, of course, is that all these racial equality laws simply hide and legitimate remaining forms of discrimination and inequality, because the argument goes, if we solve the problem of racial inequality, then, or if we solve the problem of explicit racism and racial discrimination, that then all forms of remaining racial inequality, unequal distribution of wealth, and so on across racial groups is probably, the result of innate abilities. And so in that way, then racial equality laws and institutions are complicit in reinforcing racial prejudices, and that's a problem. And so I think like I said, and in addition to that, then there's people might criticize the liberal order for being racist, for being white, for being Eurocentric, and there's a lot to those criticisms, as I also discuss in my work. But I do think that either of those extremes are not morally equivalent, right? If you just say there's no racism in the liberal order, or you say the liberal order is all about racism, I'm not saying there are, morally equivalent. I'm more with the latter. But I do want to, I think that it is more helpful to take a more nuanced position and recognize the ways in which the racial equality principle enshrined in international laws and institutions actually empower advocates of racial equality. And we see that in struggles for racial equality domestically, including against Jim Crow laws, as well as the struggle for decolonization internationally. Anti-colonial nationalists and civil rights advocates were able to use the principle of equality embedded in liberalism to push for equality. So I would not that easily dismiss equality in liberalism and the liberal order as cynically as just something that's just for show. I think there's something there. Okay. But I think we want to make sure that does not blind us to the many forms of inequality and discrimination that's going on. And I think that's where it is so helpful to look at some of the critical race literature and other useful scholarship like that. So I think we don't need to embrace one or the other end. When we're teaching and thinking about the liberal order, we can acknowledge the value of racial equality, that's de jure racial equality, while at the same time understanding its complicated relationship with de facto inequality. And so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, thank you very much. That's super helpful. And I've found certainly over the last few years, reading outside the standard IR literature has been so helpful, particularly the post-colonial and critical race studies stuff, to help me kind of understand it better. We do have somewhere a bibliography that our speakers have contributed. Maybe Jenna, our Mortara leader, can put that up in the chat, the link to some of those readings. So we have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to kind of group some of them together. I have two questions that dovetail a tiny bit, which are one question about sort of a little bit of a kind of maybe a skeptical view of the role of race as an independent causal factor. One of the attendees asks about whether, essentially whether actually the yellow peril and so on is really a function of power politics, that in fact race is used in a much more sort of straightforward way by motivated political actors who see it as a resource, but that it's not actually driven by a more deep-seated discrimination, but actually can shift and change depending on the political interests of the actor. And then another question about, which I think is somewhat related, which is how do you engage people who disagree that there is in fact this sort of embedded racism? What would be your argument to those kind of questions that would sort of essentially deny the power of racism in producing these various types of outcomes?
Thank you. Great questions. So the first one, the role of independent causal factor, race as an independent causal factor. Certainly, I would not claim that race is an independent causal factor. I think it is very much intertwined with all kinds of economic, geopolitical, and other problems, including issues related to gender. So I think it is wrong to think about it as independent, but I also think that it is wrong to reduce it to other issues such as power politics. So if we think about, the more specific aspect of the question, is race simply a resource that instrumental or opportunistic politicians can use to refer to, things like Kung Flu and similar things to elicit hostility regarding China today? Yes, there's no doubt that the race card, so to say, can be played in that way, but why do we expect it to have an impact? It is because these arguments resonate with the audience, and the reason why they resonate with the audience is partly because people hold racial prejudices, even if these prejudices are maybe more implicit in some cases, and individuals may not necessarily be aware of them. And so because of that, I think it's more fruitful to think about how race can be used as an instrument in power politics rather than simply reducing it and denying it any explanatory value. And so and you see that as, you look at the kind of the history of bilateral relations between the US on the one hand and China and Japan on the other. There are all these racial prejudices that are there, that are latent, but they're activated at different points in time, right? Japan is rising at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Suddenly Japan is the yellow peril. We're friendlier towards China. The US is friendlier towards China. And gradually, then there's World War II. Japan loses World War II, becomes an American ally. We have the Korean War. Suddenly, the yellow peril shifts to and is embodied by China, right? And then there's a shift back of the yellow peril to Japan in the 1970s, 1980s. And now China is again the yellow peril. And so certainly these prejudices follow power politics a little bit. They get activated at different points in time given the geopolitical context, but that doesn't mean that they don't play an important role in how we perceive others and how we interact with others in our foreign policy. So I think there's a complex relationship there that I wouldn't reduce to the independent causal factor of race, but I think we can do better to examine how the two are related. And second question, how do we engage people who disagree that there's embedded racism? I mean, all you can do is try to make the most persuasive argument that you can make and provide as much empirical evidence that you can. And beyond that, what can you do, right? Where you're just hoping people are open-minded enough to accept your argument, the power of the better argument, if you indeed have the better argument. So in this case, for embedded racism, you would want to, I think you can point, especially historically, to a lot of racial prejudice that indeed has underpinned these carve-outs. So if you look at the archives, people at the time were talking very explicitly about these things. And so you can find historical evidence. Now today, it is probably easier to find evidence that focuses on outcomes rather than focus on the prejudices of specific individuals, although that's still possible, it's still present. You can also look at how specific institutions unevenly impact different racial and ethnic groups. And so you can bring statistical evidence to bear, and you can show that those, if you can show that those differential impacts are not explained by legitimate and objective reasons, then you have a very strong case for embedded racism that would also stand up in court, right? Because that's the kind of the institutional racism argument that people make in legal contexts.
Yeah, it's been really exciting to see kind of, great work starting to come out that does exactly this, that kind of, really tries to do systematic empirical work. And sometimes that question I should have said was asked by Michaela Forster, is much more convincing. It's been fascinating to see the work that's come out around gender, and particularly sort of, for scholars to look at citation counts, to look at teaching evaluations, the sort of really hard empirical evidence we have about how bias structures outcomes around labor markets, around evaluations, subjective, evaluations, things like that. That I have a lot of colleagues who I think have been much more convinced about the realities of the biases around us because of that work. So it's been exciting to see that. Okay, I have a bunch of questions. I have sort of three questions that I'm going to try to put together a little bit. Errol Henderson very correctly pointed out that, to talk only about Black Lives Matter as a transnational movement is to evade the importance of thinking through the various actors who are pushing against anti-racism, and that we need to also think through and call attention to, the other side of the story. And Xiao Li and Amos Hor both kind of want you to talk a little bit about, where you think we should push for people who want to see anti-racism go forward. You talk about the international level, you talk about the more domestic level. Where do you see it being key to moving forward anti-racism?
Thank you for those questions as well. To Errol Henderson's point, yes, I very much concur that you can't just focus on how transformative forces organize transnationally, and I also focus on how traditional forces organize transnationally in my forthcoming IOPs that I mentioned, because indeed these struggles between the two coalitions play out not just in specific domestic contexts, but transnationally and internationally. And so, yes, that's very, very much on point. And in fact, currently I'm working on a paper with a co-author on white supremacist terrorism. And you see that's just one example of how one segment of the traditional coalition organizes transnationally, right? But there are many other examples. If you look at far right parties and political movements, you see much of that. And so, yes, that's absolutely true. We that's part of the picture. And again, that's what when I'm trying to understand how the current struggles play out, and how struggles between what we see protesters and counter protesters play out. We need to look at both of those sides, which again are obviously not morally equivalent. So thank you to Errol for pointing that important issue out. The other question, where to push for anti-racism to go forward, that's not an easy question. I think for those of us concerned about the fate of racial equality, both internationally and domestically, there are important lessons to be learned in the kind of in the decades when decolonization was happening, and then the decades shortly after that. So if you look at 1960s, 1970s, I think there are some important lessons there, and even before that. And one important lesson that I learned was that the transformative coalition does best when its domestic segments cooperate with counterparts abroad, right? And that is very clearly exemplified by the close cooperation between civil rights activists and anti-colonial nationalists. So if you look at civil rights activists like Martin Luther King, he was very much closely cooperating with anti-nationalists, anti-colonial nationalists like Kwame Nkrumah, who was Ghana's first prime minister and president. And whenever Nkrumah would come to the UN in New York, he would also visit the Harlem and express support for the US civil rights movement. And these two kind of aspects, or these two contingents of the transformative coalition, worked very hard together to push for decolonization and the abolishment, the abolishing of domestic racist institutions and laws. And they saw these as two sides of white supremacy, and they worked together to fight them. And I think today something similar needs to be done. We need to treat the problem internationally, transnationally, because that's when the transformative coalition is at its strongest. Other issues that could be done at the international level, I'm going to just mention two things. One, just like Kate mentioned the gender literature earlier, and that is tremendously helpful, I think, in learning where we can go. But even in terms of policy, it is helpful. If you look at gender mainstreaming, for example, at the European Union, I think it contains valuable lessons for race, because you don't want racial equality laws to be segregated and siloed in one corner of an international organization. You want these to be mainstreamed as well. So mainstreaming racial equality would simply mean that you're not just concerned about racial equality when it comes to issues specifically related, obviously related to race, but when an international organization deals with climate change, when it deals with similar issues like that, it considers the racial implications of its policies. And so that's also this mainstreaming of racial equality is very important too. And the third issue that I'm going to mention is this. It might be useful to have something like a racial equality fund administered under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And there are a number of funds in the UN system, but one issue with them is that often donor states have a lot of say over how the funds are spent. And what would be different with a racial equality fund is that donor states would not have a say in that. It would basically be up to the recipient states to decide what to do with the funds. And I think that is symbolically very powerful and important. And I also think that could be an important first step towards issues like reparations. And so I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you for that. Really, really, really helpful. And, I do think the Biden administration has actually been moving towards thinking through how to make racial justice, actually, as well as climate, part and parcel of every international engagement agreement, and again, to go back to GPEP, the notion that markets can't be isolated in some kind of separate world. Rather, we need to understand that markets implicate and are structured by all of these different processes. And so, I'm hopeful that the Biden team will go forward with that. It'll be very interesting to see Linda Thomas Greenfield as the UN ambassador, potentially, given her background and her expertise and knowledge, I think it's possible that we could move in that direction. Okay, I'm going to give you two questions at once because we only have a few more minutes to finish up. The first one is from Emily Schaurendenbach. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she is curious about our moment with the pandemic and thinking about the pandemic and potentially also sort of interactions with maybe also sort of transformations in technology, do you see this as simply worsening, or might it potentially ameliorate this sort of evasion of international norms that's going on? How does the pandemic intersect with the stories that you're telling? And then finally, the very first question we had actually was Scott Siegel, who was asking about your experience of studying race for some time in IR, that in fact, as some of our attendees today know very well, the study of race has been marginalized in IPE and IR forever, right? For reasons we can all, know what those are. And so what kind of support and pushback from the IR academic community you've gotten along the way? What would you sort of recommend in terms of thinking through how we might move forward to actually, bring this knowledge of race into the center of IR? So pandemic and the kind of broader question about what we should be doing to make sure more people can effectively study these questions.
Right, thank you. Emily, thank you for the question. Pandemic moment, technology, how these issues might relate to evasion. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I think I think I would need more time to think through what the pandemic would do to evasion. I think my quick immediate reaction is just that to the extent that the pandemic leads to economic difficulties, there may be more hostility towards certain racial minorities, and certainly when it comes to the Roma, we see that they continue to be scapegoats, and they often are seen as kind of the main vectors of the virus, spreading the virus. They are not, abiding by quarantines, and so unfortunately, I don't think that the pandemic means much in terms of, or brings much positive news to the Roma in the context of norm evasion. I guess the one hope that I would have is that because the pandemic reveals and even magnifies racial inequality and brings more attention to it, that it would help hopefully galvanize some segments of the transformative coalition as well, and so at least hold on to at least avoid further racial regress, if not maybe pushing forward. And we know that racial equality gains are often made in the wake of great wars, huge calamities, and maybe the current moment will be something like that. So I think I'd like to think positively about it, but unfortunately, we need to be aware that there will be also a lot of difficulties. The second question, my experience with studying race. It's a great question, and Scott, please feel free to reach out. The race community in IR is not huge, and I think most people, when you reach out to me, you reach out to anyone studying race, you will get a positive response, and we're happy to talk about our experiences. But we have only limited time today, and what I'll say is that initially my experience was that people who have studied race for a long time, like Errol, were very positive and supportive. Others who did not see race as a legitimate topic, and so I would get blank stares, or even people would be genuinely concerned for me and for my career for studying something that was not a real IR topic, right? But I think that things are changing, however slowly, and I don't want to overstate this optimism, but when you look at the job ads this year, it's encouraging to see more race jobs, and hopefully it's not just a blip. Hopefully it's something that will continue. And there's the GPEP series is one kind of tangible kind of evidence that there's more attention to race. And so I think that although it's never easy to study a new issue, there's much support from the emerging race community in IR, and people are starting to get more and more interested in it. So I would encourage anyone who wants to study the issue to do so, And like I said, I'm always available. I'm always an email away or a Skype conversation away. So please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk. Thank you for those great questions.
Yeah, and a lot of the questioners said thank you for your wonderful research and for the presentation, and I will join with that, that this has really been a treat, and so nice to really be able to talk through really difficult questions together, and wish you best of luck going forward with your work. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come to talk to us today. Everyone else, thank you very much for being here. Thanks for the great questions. We do have a little bit of a break, and we'll come back after the new year. Our next roundtable is going to be on development and race. It should be very interesting. Unfortunately, I think Jenna hopefully put in, nope, thanks very much, Zoltán, says Errol, but Jenna, I hope, can put in maybe the link to the next talk, and we hope to welcome everyone back then, healthy and well. And again, thanks so much, Zoltán. Really appreciate you being with us today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone for participating and for the great questions. Thank you.